Diamonds is an emotionally rich and visually striking film. What's equally fascinating is how it was made. The team didn't use traditional animation or live action. Instead, they built a workflow around generative AI. The process was still incredibly human. What did the pre-production process look like?
Yeah, our pre-production process was a lot of just planning, I think. For us, that entailed doing both storyboards and sort of more look development. And then I was also kind of off doing my own studies as well. Yeah, for our storyboards, I ended up just drawing them out, mostly just like in Photoshop, maybe with like a little bit of assistance of like generative fill for textures and things like that. But pretty much like every shot in film, there has been like a corresponding board with it. For look development too, it was kind of like pulling a lot of these different references that we could use for both looking at like environments and like character design. I think one big challenge, especially with generative AI, is that there's a certain look that I think like the ocean tends to have whenever you try to like prompt for something. But for this film, I knew that I really needed every layer of the ocean to have its own character and like level of detail in the background, and sort of these different like environments, like rocks, corals, everything. And so just trying to like pull together good references for that. Lighting references too. I think one of the quirks of making an ocean film is that a lot of the training data these models use, a lot of it is undersea submarine footage where it's like maybe you see a lot of this like front light, like everything's super bright, but we wanted to go for a more cinematic look to it. So it was just kind of like pulling those kinds of images for the team to like understand, like what's the direction we want to go. Yeah, and then like finally like with character design, it was really about, looking at these like different elements or like different examples of like how we might be able to bring those different characters to life. Like some of them are very just one-to-one with reality, going with the photoreal style, like the first stage of the blobfish and this like anglerfish, like all these sardines. Like we didn't have to go like too far in depth with those just because I think there's just like a proper way of like what that looks in real life. But then there are certain characters, like for example, there's like a siren character who we had like a little bit more like artistic liberty with, and so figuring out like what features like we wanted to have with her design and just trying to figure out how to like incorporate that. But yeah, and then just like looking a lot at like different references as well. I think I mentioned like Planet Earth was like a big inspiration in terms of not just like looking at the ocean itself, but I think the way that that is shot as well and lit, where it feels a lot more cinematic than just kind of your like typical undersea footage. Yeah, and then even I ended up going to some like aquariums around LA to just like look at like fish movements and like fish anatomy, just to like get a better understanding of how they move and just being able to see that. Yeah, it's just kind of like a little bit of everything.
How did you direct or collaborate with your team during production?
Yeah, so I guess like during production, we ended up having a group of AI artists who were going in and creating the shots. So I guess sort of similar to how in like traditional animation or VFX where you assign artists like shots for them to work on, it was sort of the same thing, except we gave each person sequences so that they could have a little bit more of that like continuity and just like ownership over, that specific part of the film. Yeah, and basically how it worked was we'd kind of start out with these like still images that they would create, using like a variety of different tools. And once that was in a good place, we'd then put it into motion, and then from there kind of generating all these different versions of the shot. Yeah, but I think it's like still the notes review process, very similar to how you would do any other sort of like moving image project. Yeah, but it was just like, the tools to make the shots were just a little bit different.
When you're talking about shots, since we're using prompts here, are you treating a prompt like a shot?
I guess the prompts are the shots. I think for this, like, because our final product, it's a film, it's a frame, it's a shot-based medium. And so that kind of informs the workflow. Every shot has its own prompt. There's not like too much of a variety. You don't want to be too broad with each prompt. I think AI, like, it helps to be very, very specific. And so part of that was like taking the storyboards, knowing how those shots come together to tell the story, and then trying to recreate those shots within the model. And there are like limitations within these models, certain things that they do better than others. But for the most part, we used storyboards as a blueprint of knowing like how many shots we needed to create a certain scene, and then kind of breaking it down from there.
With AI, how did you find the compositing, the editing, the color grading using this tool?
I mean, like, we're still in that process. I don't think we're fully like through post at all. But I guess like as far as like the editing goes, I think it's pretty similar to how you would do an animated film. I think for me, like, especially having come out of that, putting together like an animatic with like the storyboards where we're actually like timing things out and doing sound effects. So post-production, not fully out of it yet, but we are in editing. I think for the editing process with this so far, it's actually mirrored the traditional animation process a lot, where we've started with an animatic, actually putting those storyboards together and timing them out, cutting in like sound effects and things like that, even doing like temp VO, just to like get an idea of like what the film is supposed to feel like and having something that we can like work towards. And so afterwards, it's like we start to get the shots back and are like kind of cutting them in. And I think in that respect, like it is sort of a blend of like live action and animation, where I think with AI, like it's not necessarily, you don't need to use the full shot that comes out of the image model. In fact, like, sometimes like the first 2 seconds or the last 3 seconds are not the most usable. And so I think with that, it's really like going through and finding the best moments and kind of like assembling it from there. And so I think that's been kind of like an interesting challenge with this film. That being said, I think the nice thing about it being generative is like if a shot isn't working, you can go back to the artist and be like, I need you to do this version of it and like try something different. So it's been a lot of just kind of trying to adapt to what we can actually get out of the models. For example, character entrances into a frame are really difficult. Like if they're not in the starting frame, it's really difficult for an AI model to understand the concept of like off-screen space. And so there were like a few moments like that that originally storyboarded, and so we kind of had to like adapt the film and the shots where it could kind of still feel the same or have the same intent, but it's just not like necessarily exactly to my quote-unquote vision of what it originally was. But that's okay. I mean, like, I think the thing with filmmaking is just that like you might have an idea of what the film is going to be at the very beginning of the process, but by the end, it kind of really evolves and it becomes its own living thing. And so you really just want to get out of the way of that and kind of help shape it rather than impose your will onto the film.
As a director, how do you maintain control over the artistic voice while using AI?
Yeah, I think as a director, it's really all about curation, and I think this is where like you really want to work very closely with your editor. And our editor on this project, Augustine, he is awesome. It's been really fun working with him and trying to figure out this whole puzzle. But I think it's really being able to know what you're looking for with these images. Maybe your film, you like really want it to be very clean and like perfect and have like a certain style. I think for this film, it's like it is sort of on the edge between this like photoreal but then also like abstract place. And so like knowing when to lean into those things to really like support the story, I think that's really important. Yeah, I think it really just all goes back to understanding your story, understanding the film and why you are making certain choices, like why you're on a certain shot at that moment to really support the character and their journey. And I think that's like a lesson that goes beyond even like AI filmmaking. It's just like knowing what you have is cohesive and kind of creates this overall vision.
Can you talk about the animation style?
Yeah, so I think the animation style for this is a lot more grounded than a typical animated film. Like the fish, okay, it does blink, and that was just something we couldn't prompt around in the model, but other than that, it is supposed to act very much just like a fish out in the wild. Like, it's not overly expressive, it doesn't have these like really realistic facial expressions, and I think a lot of the emotion is more communicated in its body language and the shot choices, as well as like the sound design and music. So using those tools to kind of like help create that emotion and kind of connecting the audience like with that subjectivity. I think this film really lends itself to generative AI very well because it's underwater, and so physics looks really different there. And I think a lot of AI video that comes out right now, you know, it has like a very floaty motion style where like if you're just looking at a human like doing that, it feels kind of uncanny, but because it's underwater, like it just makes a lot more sense. And so for us, like that has worked out really well. And I think another thing too about AI is that like fluidity and how it can do interpolation very well. And that was something that was really important for me, just because, you know, there's this like transformation of this fish where we are spending like a significant amount of time in a physical state that it normally like doesn't really spend much time in. And so being able to kind of like visualize that and extrapolate and kind of create this like grotesqueness, I think is really helped by like the medium itself.